Good evening, my friends. Hope you can hear me okay. I hadn't tested the microphone, but I have a good sense. It says that I'm using the right one. Welcome to our show tonight. I'm excited about this show because, of course, with all these things, it always ends up that there's a reason, as if, by an invisible hand, there's a reason why these books come up when they do. Tonight, we're talking about Hans Hoppe's, Hans Hermann Hoppe, a German academic, immigrated to the United States, 1984, perhaps maybe 85. Actually, I think that's right. It's 1985. Student of Habermas, studied under Murray Rothbard from 1982, 83, something like that, in his New York seminar. And as a result of the studies, he wrote first in German and then translated to English his first great book. And I still think that it really is the Hoppe of war, in a way. It is the sum of his contribution to economics and politics. The book is published initially by Kluwer Academic Publishers in 1985, called The Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. And I still think, even to this day, it's the best, sort of theoretical book on comparative systems that you can possibly ever get. I don't know of a better one. It's a summary of a great way of classifying economic systems. And why should we classify economic systems? Why should we classify political systems? Well, they help us. They help us understand. It gets frustrating looking at the world out there without a coherent theory of what we're looking at. What is the difference between Franco's Spain and Sweden in the 1980s, between Venezuela and Brazil, between Russia and the United States? What is the distinction between these types of systems? What was the difference between Mexican style socialism and, say, a Maoist socialism? And what Hoppe does is he lays out four distinct types of what he calls socialism. Now, to buy into this, you have to just stop arguing about what socialism is and isn't, and just accept Hoppe's definitions. I mean, you can reject them if you want, right? But to understand the book, you have to just accept it. Words are just, after all, symbols. They're just symbols, There's no particular arrangement of letters that form a word that we say that has an inherent meaning that's somehow, granted as if by God or something. They're all kind of cultural artifacts that come to us as symbols for conceptual understandings of some subject. So words are always approximations of anything. That's why I never, ever want to get hung up on words and definitions. To me, it's the first sign of a shabby thinker that they want to sit around and argue about definitions of things. It's like, whatever. You don't like my definition? Come up with a different word that seems to meet with my conception of what I'm trying to talk about. As long as we're talking about the same thing, then any word will suffice. It doesn't really matter. So the word socialism, let's not argue about what you think it means historically or presently or otherwise. What socialism to Hoppe means in this book is the presence of the state in some or all aspects of life. That's essentially it. There are only two Sorry, I seem to have lost my connection there. I hope everybody's still with me. No, because capitalism is not a system that's imposed by law. It doesn't come about from a particular piece of legislation. It doesn't even come about by a result of a social contract or a decision on the part of anybody. It's what happens, in an emergent form in the absence of the state. So people develop their own the respect for private property, accumulated unto themselves. That property is respected. Trading emerges. The system that comes out of that is very, Hans would say, natural. Another word you could use is organic, or just integral to the structure of the social order. Capitalism is something we do when we go about life in smart, intelligent, peaceful ways. That's all it is. It doesn't mean rule by corporations. It doesn't mean a system whereby capital is dominant over labor. It doesn't mean a privilege for the property owning classes. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means a society of intelligent, cooperative engagement that respects private property in the absence of the state. So the presence of the state must necessarily take over some pre-existing institution. So if you posit a system, for example, whereby the state owns the courts, where is the state going to get those courts? Do they not exist before the presence of the state? We're running around, we're having disputes, we can't figure out what the hell to do. Oh my God, nobody knows what to do. We've got all these conflicts. Shouldn't we have some way to resolve them? I don't know. Maybe. Do you have an idea? I don't know what to do. What do you think? And then somebody comes along and says, well, I have a great idea. Since we don't know what the hell to do, why don't we give a bunch of guns to the small group of thugs over here and tell them to represent us and let them figure out the problem? And we do that, and then magically, as if by some astonishing intelligence descends upon this new group of people, to come up with an idea that nobody else was able to come up with, and they invent this thing called courts. No, that is not, in fact, what happens. What happens is that there are already existing courts, and the presence of the state, nationalizes them, takes them over, or makes them socialistic, to use Hans's phrase. So socialism is always parasitical. It takes over pre-existing institutions. It doesn't create new ones. It takes over pre-existing private institutions and turns them into part of the state apparatus. Whatever aspect of the state, even the most minimal state, the police. All right, so clearly, protection agencies have always been part of life. I mean, even if you go back 150,000 years, with the very first guy who decided to grow green beans, outside of his cave, he's got to figure out a way to protect those green beans once they start growing from predators coming in. So he hires, he gives somebody the right to protect it, in exchange for which they get some green beans for the first pick of the crop. Those are the first police. Okay, so police exist prior to the state. Everything exists prior to the state. There's nothing that the state invents on its own. It's always parasitical. So I think Hans is right to treat, in a sense, all existing state institutions as inherently socialistic. It takes an institution that used to be provided through private exchange and contract, and by means of private property and peace, and turns it into a monopolistic service that excludes competition, exists in a certain geographical realm, and live and finds the essential its essential life is fed through a coercion, through aggression of property, namely through taxation or pillaging people, doing to us what we're not allowed to do to each other, essentially. So this is socialism. So for Hans, and I like this classification system. I think it's actually marvelous. And in the first instance, it gets rid of the myth of the minimal state, right? The idea that we're going to have just a tiny little state that does just minimal things. Now, everything the state does, it provides monopolistically, and it's doing, instead of the private sector, what would otherwise be doing the same thing. to the extent it's useful. Now, it's true that public sectors do some things the private sector would never do, like build nuclear weapons, like invading countries all across the world, slaughtering innocents, building gas chambers and putting whole populations in them, sending millions to the gulag, and so on. The state does innovate certain things that the private sector would never have come up with, thank God. Nonetheless, to the extent the state does anything that seems to be useful, it has to take them over from private industry. So that's from private enterprise. So that's his basic framework. You got capitalism on one hand, socialism on the other. Capitalism is only one thing. It is a world of private exchange and private property with no state. All existence of all states take us steps away from capitalism to various degrees, one step at a time. So it's obvious from this description that there's only one form of system, one system of social and economic organization that exists in the world, and it is called socialism. So that's what Hans would say. We live in a socialist world, but there's many kinds of socialism. Now, there's another way to render this kind of theory, and I would put it this way. If you think about the state as being basically a conspiracy of the ruling class to trick us into going along with letting other people rule us through violence that otherwise we would be outraged by, we have to have an ideological rationale for their existence. We have to believe that they're doing something for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. And there's many different flavors that this kind of ruling class control over the world takes. Different times in different places. Statism always takes a different form. It's always the same thing in the end. It's always the same machinery at work, but it always has the different basis. And it's always mutating all the time. I mean, it's true in U.S. history, for example. You can look back and see that, at one time the state was essential to protecting the right of people to own slaves, and for entrenching the existence of slavery. Much later, the state became essential for ending slavery. So it's the same state, right? Well, the culture changed, and the state found a way to reinvent itself. It's the same thing. Race relations is a great example of this, because the U.S. state has been used historically always as a protection of slavery and a perpetuator of racial injustice. So after slavery, suddenly the apparatus of the state got rid of slavery, and then it quickly nationalized, freed slaves, drafted them into armies, and sent them to kill Indians. And then after that, you had the advent of Jim Crow laws leading to segregation, zoning laws, labor regulation. All these things are designed to achieve and entrench and bring about segregation of the races and separation of population groups. Fast forward 70 years, and the culture has changed again. And now the state finds a new rationale. It's got to stop segregation and stop, racial injustice. So then it becomes, essential again. So the state, the very thing that had perpetuated the injustice, becomes, the alleged enemy of the very injustice that it perpetuated, and perpetuates other forms of injustice, and so on. So the state always takes a different rationale. I mean, so it's the same thing in propping up capital and propping up monopolistic forms of private ownership. So in the late 19th century, of course, the state was a major source of entrenching monopolistic provision of many services, military industrial complex. Working with the ruling class to prop up monopoly capitalism, you could call it. It's a different definition that Hoppe uses. And then 20 years later, suddenly with antitrust laws, the state, reinvents itself and now is the enemy of monopoly capital and has antitrust laws that's going to bust up the robber barons and so on. So, and on all times and places, the state takes on a different rationale. I mean, it's true. Whatever the culture is, the state will adapt to reflect, that culture. So in the age of faith, in the Middle Ages, the state was masqueraded as a kind of holy army to keep us virtuous and protect, the faith against the infidels. After the Age of Enlightenment, then suddenly the state reinvents itself to become the thing that is going to protect us against religious fanaticism, theocracy, and so on. Same institution, a different rationale. All times and places, the state tends to reflect the cultural, social priorities of the population that it rules. Because above all else, the state wants to rule. A very implausible institution by itself. We don't need it. So why does it exist? It's got to come up with some basis for its existence. So Hoppe comes up with four general categories, and they are this. He says basically it's left socialism, right socialism, or the socialism of conservatism. Like pure socialism, like Russian style socialism, conservatism, or right socialism, like you get and say, I think of it as like a Tory British style conservatism, but you see it in the US, and it's a very strange form in the US. Slightly different from Toryism. Mostly what Hans describes here is Tory-like, and it actually has more in common with US style conservatism than we'll talk about that. And then you have social democratic style socialism, which is more or less the mixed systems that don't nationalize industry, but they have a tremendous amount of redistribution. And then a fourth style, which he refers to as a kind of a positivist piecemeal socialism that we might better describe as a sort of technocracy, a rule by experts who are just kind of making it up as they go along. Those are the four kinds of socialisms that exist in the world. And all of them stand apart from anarcho-capitalism. So that's his model. And each chapter kind of goes through these four forms of socialism: pure socialism, right socialism, or conservative socialism. Social democracy, it's not totalitarian, there's democratic welfare states. And then pure technocracies, which, and you'll notice just from those descriptions that US is all four forms in one, So these are archetypes that are existing in pure form, but having the archetypes in mind helps you to understand the world a little bit better. So I want to kind of march through those four forms with a particular focus on right socialism, because I think that's the kind that's least understood. And I think his chapter on this is extremely powerful and prescient. But before doing that, I do want to highlight what of this book in particular, what I think is, maybe the single greatest accomplishment of this book. And it happens in the opening chapters, where he restates Mises and Rothbard's, I would say maybe just the Austrian conception of what society is, where it comes from. And he begins with ownership of the individual and the awareness that we all have of being self-owners. He finds it indisputably true that we are self-owners. And he makes very famously, an argument that says, if we're not self-owners, it would not be possible for us to argue against the idea of self-ownership. Because in the act of arguing itself, we are exercising volition, control of our vocal cords, control of our bodies, and control over our words and our minds, and that those are presumed in the very act of argumentation itself. He calls it an argumentation ethics, that that to argue against self-ownership would itself be a performative contradiction, in the sense that we're acting as if the thing we're arguing against already exists. It would be preposterous to argue against self-ownership, for example, because in so doing, we're presuming the existence of self-ownership just from the very act of arguing, using our own vocal cords, using our own bodies, exercising volition. You can see and observe the existence of self-ownership even in the existence of somebody arguing for or against it. So it's presumed. It's a built-in part of who we are. And it's not possible to argue against self-ownership without being engaged in a performative contradiction. So there's that. He begins with that. But then he goes to private property. And this is the thing where I think, and his argument is not perfect, but as far as I can tell, it's the best presentation I've ever seen in any book I've ever read on why private property exists. Now, you'd think that in the libertarian literature, and literature generally, that the subject of private property and where it comes from would be well rehearsed. Everybody must have discussed this. Surely, the great champions of private property, from St. Thomas Aquinas through John Locke, through Rothbard, and so on, Ayn Rand, I don't know whom else, just every famous figure, Thomas Paine, William Graham Sumner, would have explained why it's essential to have private property. But what's funny is that you quite often dip into these thinkers, and what you find is defenses of private property, but not very good explanations for why it exists in the first place. Rand, for example, wrote very beautiful, compelling defenses of private property. In this absence, you're going to have slavery. In this absence, you're going to have collectivism. Without private property, we're all just pillaging each other and all the rest of it. But it's funny, her defense of private property presumes its existence. It doesn't actually explain why it has to exist. That sort of meta question, why do we need it at all? Not a case for its perpetuation. I'm not asking for a case for why we should have something other than private property. Just a pure case of why does it exist in the first place? Why can't we live in a state of socialism? And in many ways we do. If you think of me right now as a distributor of ideas, a person who's producing ideas and passing them on to you, these goods that I'm producing right now while I'm talking to you can be owned socialistically. You can take them with you and pass them on to your neighbor. There's no reason to have any kind of private property strictures around it. They're communistically provided. They're socialistically owned. Ideas can be owned by anybody at any time. Why is it that we find it so important to establish private property over things like the small bracelet? Why do I want to believe that I am the owner of this? Why do we have a social ethos that says, this is mine, not yours? Whereas the things I'm saying to you right now are potentially belong to the whole world. Why do we do? Is it just why are we doing this? Is it completely arbitrary? Or is there some actual fundamental basis for the existence of private property? And you'd be surprised. You go through the literature and try to discover an answer to this question, and you don't find it. I mean, it's weird. My friend Stefan Cassella and I have done widespread searches of literature on this topic and not found anything. And the funny thing is, it's even true in reading Murray Rothbard. You think, the great philosopher of private property, who put private property as the central pillar of his political thinking, to try to find a place in his work where he actually addresses this point. Why do we own some things collectively and other things privately? And what's the distinction between the two? And why have we arrived at this consensus? Why does private property have to exist in the first place? Why does it have to? Why do we have to do this? And the answer is elusive. I mean, it's true in thinker after thinker. But this is where I think, Hans needs more credit, because it's in this opening chapter where he actually lays out a rationale. He does it, he's got a very powerful mind, right? So he's a very honest thinker too. He lets you travel with him as he's laying out deductively his theory, and invites you to discover where he's wrong. But he never skips any steps. I mean, he's, as far as he's able, very anxious to lay out his whole theory for you, step by step, so you can see what steps he takes. And in so doing, he does this fabulous thing where he actually provides a really solid basis for why private property has to exist. And the reason comes down to the fact that while many goods in the world can be owned collectively, namely ideas, and recipes, theories, art, music, many things, anything that's infinitely reproducible, anything that allows us to enter into a utopia of plenty, where we don't have to divide it up because there's no conflicts over ownership. So if I sing you a song, you can sing that song and take it with you, and nobody's harmed, in the course of that, physically harmed. There are other goods that can only be controlled through the exclusive volition of individuals. So that my control of this small bracelet excludes your control. And if you want to control it, you're going to have to take it from me. If I want to control it, I'm going to have to keep you from taking it from me. So there's a contest. If we both want it, we're going to have to either fight or trade. In the presence of such physical facts as scarcity, namely, there's not enough to go around, there will always be some competition, some rivalry for control. In the presence of that physical fact, we have to have an institution that acknowledges and codifies that control as belonging to the exclusive domain of one individual or another individual. And that is called private property. It's not an institution that's necessarily wonderful. It's not something that's necessarily moral or should have to exist. It's maybe in some sense regrettable. We'd love to live in a world in which I could just, you could take this bracelet out of my hand digitally and you could all have that. And if that were true, then I would be happy to press the magic button and make that true. Unfortunately, it's not true. Physical reality has prevented that from happening. So as a result, we establish private property as a means of peace, as a way of permitting us to have the best possible chance, to have the best possible life through trade and exchange and cooperation. Socialism does not address this problem. So I can't just announce that I want this bracelet to be socialistically owned. That will accomplish nothing. It's just that's just wordplay, essentially, because since socialism is physically impossible. It's physically impossible to have socialism over scarce goods. So in other words, Hans's theory is that the very existence of scarcity itself is what gives rise to this institution of private property. In its absence, private property would not be necessary. Now, as soon as I say that to you, you might be thinking, yeah, I get that. Well, yeah, you get it once I state it, but why is it that thousands of years had to go by and nobody could seem to identify that? It's amazing. It's amazing. Go through the works of Rand and see if you can discover even one sentence in which she discerns that scarcity is the necessary and sufficient physical condition for the rise of and the existence of private property. You will not find it. It's amazing. Locke, same situation. Mises, my beloved mentor, Rothbard, they never specify this condition. They can hint at it. They walk around it. The only thinker I can think of that specifically figured this out was Benjamin Tucker, a 19th century anarchist thinker. And by the way, I'm open to correction on this. I mean, if you think I'm wrong, please email me, tucker@fee.org, at Liberty.me, and show me where I'm wrong about this point. But apart from Hans Hoppe, the only other thinker I know who's specifically named scarcity as the necessary and sufficient condition for the existence of private property is Benjamin Tucker, the 19th century anarchist thinker. But he Tucker's a frustrating thinker in many ways. I mean, I just got through reading his big book instead of a book. And wow, when he's great, he's great. When he's bad, he's really bad. It's such an inconsistent application of the principle. I mean, he sort of gets the principle more or less right. But he does it in a negative sense. Like he only advances the principle of scarcity as a precondition for the existence of private property and arguing against intellectual property, and particularly patents. But he doesn't lay it out as the core principle in his theory like Hans does. Hans puts it front and center in his social theory. It only takes one chapter. It's very short, but it's beautiful. And so I think even Hans's description of this has some missteps. And you can read it for yourself and see where you think the missteps are. I think the missteps are. He gives. I hope I'm not misstating this. He gives the example of a Schlaraffenland, a utopia, where there's an infinite number of bananas that are available to everybody, and therefore we wouldn't have to have private property in bananas because there's so many of them. I don't think that's quite a very good example, actually, because bananas that are subject to depreciation, that are a homogeneous good. Bananas take up physical space. I'd rather have bananas that are closer to me rather than ones that are further away. If some guy comes along and grabs my bananas that are next to me, I'm going to be pissed because I have to walk an extra 10 feet to get an extra banana, and time is scarce. So I don't actually think his banana example is a very good one. By the way, when I realized that I don't think the banana example is good was I was watching an Easter egg hunt one time with a bunch of children. And it was funny because I don't know if you've ever been to a children's Easter egg hunt, but typically the adults, will spread like 1,000 eggs all over the yard, right? And so you have many kids with different, differing abilities, and so they want to make sure that every kid can find an Easter egg, right? So when the kids are unleashed on the yard in the presence of, say 2,000 eggs and 10 kids, they are facing what Hans calls how does he put it? A hyperabundance, or I think he calls it a hyperabundance. I think it's his word, of goods. There is no scarcity, so to speak, of Easter eggs in this yard. So does that cause the children to go out in the yard and go, wow, we don't need private property and eggs here. There's enough eggs for everybody. We might as well just calmly live in this utopia of Easter eggs and not grab at them, not stick them in a basket, really. We should just sort of luxuriate in the yard in the presence of this plentiful resource and not establish private property over eggs, right? That doesn't happen. I can promise you that doesn't happen. So despite the vast abundance of eggs, every kid rushes out in a frenzied attempt to collect as many eggs as possible, and get very upset if some other kid comes along and grabs an egg that he saw. And so they believe they're homesteading eggs. Like, I see that egg by the tree, and some other kid grabs it, you get mad at them, and so on. So I don't think abundance alone is a condition that would lead to the non-existence of private property or collective ownership. I don't think abundance is it. It's not the sheer numeric quantity of a good that exists. I think it's all about whether or not a good necessarily has to be in the domain of exclusive physical control or not. So in that sense, an egg, an Easter egg, even if there's 10,000 of them and only 10 kids, still only one kid can pick up an egg at a time. And only that one egg can only exist in that one basket. So of course they have to establish private property rights over the eggs. On the other hand, if I brought those same 10 kids in and told them the story of Little Red Riding Hood, they're not going to have an argument among themselves about who is entitled to remember that story. You see? So you tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood to 10 kids, they're not going to fight. I want that story for me. That's my story. No, you can't have that story. That's my story. I like it more than you do. It's mine. And then get into an argument, where the adult has to come in and settle it. No, that doesn't happen. The children just naturally think the story belongs to everybody. They go away very happy. So that's the difference between Little Red Riding Hood and Easter eggs. So hope you enjoyed my soliloquy there on private property and where it comes from. Anyway, so this is a major contribution, and it improves, I would say, on any theory that had ever existed. And what's funny about this little section in the book is it's introduced very nonchalantly, Like Hans just sort of throws it out there without even drawing attention to the reader's part on the fact that he's making a unique contribution. He acts as if it existed always and everywhere, and that he hasn't said anything particularly profound. Despite his reputation, he's actually an absurdly humble man. So, in fact, in later writings, he writes the introduction to Ethics of Liberty, Rothbard's book, and he attributes his theory of private property to Rothbard, which I think wrongly attributes it. I mean, it's not Rothbard's theory. You can read his chapter in Ethics of Liberty. Rothbard does not have a scarcity-based theory of property. Rothbard has an ethical theory of property. That he thinks it's an extension of self-ownership and a natural right. He has a natural rights-based theory of property rights, and also a reductio ad absurdum-based theory. So he says, in the absence of private property, we're going to have slavery and so on. He also makes other arguments about labor and the right to keep what you work on, and the sculptor and the anyway, it doesn't matter. He does not have a scarcity-based theory of private property. Hans does. And in that sense, he's improved, as far as I'm concerned, every other theory that's ever existed. Okay, spent too much time on that. Let's get to the book. Actually, I don't think I'm going to talk about pure socialism. So pure socialism was attempted various times in history. 15th century Germany with Joachim of Fiore. I think it was 13th century Joachim of Fiore. Various cults throughout history, communist cults where, a coercive hand attempts to collectivize property. The story of Plymouth plantations, very famous under William Bradford, Massachusetts, Soviet Union. The Soviet socialist experiment lasted, 2 months after the Bolshevik Revolution. So-called war socialism is quickly abandoned. Socialism leads to vast impoverishment, famine, death. That's one reason it doesn't last. It's rarely been tried. Soviet Union, after it attempted socialism very early on, defaulted back to kind of just sort of mass bureaucratization. Nonetheless, pure socialism tends to feature nationalization of industry, the abolition of private capital. It doesn't tend to abolish private property and consumer goods. I mean, how could you do that? It's not even possible. Even the worst forms of socialism allow people to, own the clothes on their back, the bread on their table, the planter box outside their windowsill. These are not subjects of contention. The issue has to do with capital, the produced means of production, the accumulation of wealth. This, under pure socialism, is owned by the whole community, or rather by the state itself. That's the top mark of what Hans calls pure socialism, and he's right. I mean, he uses Mises' critique. The whole thing lands in famine, disasters, stasis, retrogression, shorter living lifespans, destruction of wealth. It's incompatible with any system of civilization, advanced civilization. The second form is the one I really want to talk about, because you remember we have 4 forms. We have pure socialism, we have right socialism or conservative socialism, social democracy, which, you can name Finland, Sweden. Those are pure cases in the US case. And then finally, a sort of a positivist socialism, where you just sort of make it up as you go along according to technocratic demands of scientific regime. Like you would get something like that, and that fourth form of socialism would be something like the climate change ideology in the U.S. or Council of Economic Advisors, Keynesian style economic recommendations, that sort of thing. That sort of technocratic socialism, where you just are happy to violate people's private property rights in defense of some vision of how you think the world ought to work according to some positivist standard. But the chapter I think is most brilliant here is the one I remember being initially skeptical about. It's this chapter on the socialism of conservatism. So what is that? I would say it's probably the most successful form of socialism that exists in the whole world. It was initially practiced at the end of the age of laissez-faire in the Belle Epoque in the 19th century, between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, beginning on the continent, particularly with Bismarckian-style socialism, which was not a left socialism, it was a right socialism, an attempt to preserve society as it is, a fear of the dynamism that comes with the laissez-faire society. So, and it's true, a world of capitalism, a world of without the state, is an adaptive world, one that's in a constant state of upheaval and improvement. New technologies, massive social mobility, rising wealth, new experiments in law and rules, a competitive environment where competition for excellence in the service of others leads to ever improving standards of living and an unrelenting, non-stop circulation of elites in society. Who's on top on Monday might have slipped a rung or two by Tuesday. By Thursday, some group innovation sector that was on the bottom is suddenly on top. It's a society of non-stop radical change that adapts constantly to new demands, extending out of social, cultural values of the population, together with the innovations of a competitive private enterprise entrepreneurship. That is a wild and fun and happy world to be part of. And it turns out not everybody likes it. Some people want the world to stop moving so fast. And that gives rise to conservative socialism. It has several earmarks. Hans mentions price control. Certainly, price control. What are prices? I mean, prices are just the exchange ratios we establish at the point of agreement between buyers and sellers. There's nothing that makes any particular price be high, low. There's no particular reason embedded in the structure of the universe that this bracelet would cost $1 and these glasses would cost $30 and this notebook computer that I'm on would cost $2,000. These are the outgrowth of exchange. So prices have to be adaptable, and we have to be ready to go along with whatever prices say. But a socialist conservatism wants to believe that prices should be reflective of some deeper structural, meaningful values that ought to be permanent, There was a whole generation of intellectuals that adopted this point of view. My bête noire, in this sense, my black beast of history is the extraordinarily evil T.S. Eliot, who is the single worst progenitor of conservative socialism I can possibly name to you. This was a man who seethed in a nonstop resentment against the idea of progress, mortified, in his heart and soul about the existence and rise of consumer culture. The idea that society's productive resources would be turned towards serving the rabble and the hoi polloi, ever better services, and giving to them, trashy fiction and ever more delicious food and pretty paintings in their houses, or giving them houses at all, sickened him at the core, because his whole theory of the social order is that it should be run by elites. And if the elites were not in charge, and by which he meant the cultural elites, the social and the religious elites, if they were not in charge, then, to his mind, civilization was in the process of crumbling. So all of his works were devoted to shoring up the power and prestige of a thin layer of privileged people at the top. And anything but that he considered to be like a fundamental corruption. This is T.S. Eliot, and no surprise to you, he ended up as a champion of eugenics and mass slaughter for the masses of humanity. And this is a man who wrote the book Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. Do you think a man who's an advocate of mass extermination should be writing a book about culture? I don't think so. Have a read. He thinks that culture only comes from the top down. It comes from the king and the queen. And only they can tell us how to speak, how to dress, and all the rest of us are mere understudies. This is the whole theory of socialist conservatism. And I'm mentioning T.S. Eliot, but he was one of many people. The entire elites of the academic elites of the UK and the US between about 1890 and about as late as the late 1930s. I mean, only World War II put an end to this crap. Really advocated this kind of socialist conservatism, which is really the right name for it is fascism. That's the modern name. That's what its culmination was, in history as a form of fascism. But it takes many different forms. I mentioned price control. Of course, price control is absolutely part of it. But the second thing is the abolition of competition. So you see, the competition is a fascinating institution in free enterprise, because it means that anybody can make a good or service and have access to consumers to persuade them to buy it, and gather the money and threaten to displace the pre-existing elites. So competition leads to a sort of a nonstop circulation of prestige, in society. It's passed around from institution to institution. As soon as you think you're on top, you wake up the next morning, and suddenly somebody's breathing down your neck with something even better than what you offered, and you better hop to it and get on your toes. Competition makes everybody perform at their maximum at all time. And by perform, I don't mean just like, we're not hamsters on wheels. What I mean by perform is serving others. We can never stop serving others. We can't rest on our laurels. Do you like that phrase, rest on our laurels? Like, it's a classical analogy. Laurel wreaths are things that you give to the victor, when you win, you get the laurel wreath. When you're the Caesar, you get to wear the laurels. When you're in charge, when you've won. But under capitalism, under pure capitalism society, there is no final winner. You can have the laurels for a while, but if you rest on those laurels, then you will be displaced by somebody else who does something even better. So competition is something that's fundamentally resented by the socialism of conservatism. The third mark of socialist conservatism is prohibitionism. It's always been true. Always been true. Conservatives don't think that people ought to be enjoying the things that they're enjoying. They think they like the wrong products. We like the wrong movies. We don't read the right books, really. What are we doing with this opium and this marijuana? And why the hell are people, engaging in the services of prostitutes or drinking ourselves silly, or just not living the right kinds of lives that the elites know that we should be living? So, of course, prohibitionism is always part of socialist conservatism. The left has aspects of this, right? I mean, so they want to ban cigarettes. They want to ban, red meat. You name it. There's prohibitionism. Controls on consumption have always been a feature of conservatism. A final feature that Hans mentions is authoritarian rule, and a belief that the social order extends out of the mind and convictions of great men, essentially. So we need a great man to rule us. It could be Mussolini, it could be Hitler, it could be Bismarck, it could be Franco in Spain, Stalin in Russia, Trump in the US. It's all the same theory. I'm a great man. I've done great things. I have tremendous energy and power and intelligence and the fullness and greatness of society will extend out of my heart because it's what I believe. And I'm willing to work nonstop to make this social order emerge out of my mind, out of my spirit. And then you will all be my children and live according to my desires. That is a conservative idea, one based on just the conviction that the social order is not a decentralized thing that emerges out of the values that we all hold together, but rather we're all part of a tribe and we're following some master, perfect person. What's he a master of? He's a master of religion, maybe, like Franco. Maybe he's a master of the culture and understanding the people and their true nature, like Hitler. Maybe he's a master of fulfilling the historical destiny, of the classical world, as Mussolini was. Or in the case of Donald Trump, the most comical figure alive on the planet today. He alone is the master of making billions of dollars and becoming a reality television star. Wouldn't you know it, the American form of fascism would be the most superficial form of fascism to ever exist in history. It's pretty funny. Anyway, if you want to understand Trump, read Hans's chapter on on socialist conservatism. Anyway, I'm going to conclude here, and I can't believe our hour is gone. With the recommendation that you have a look at this book. Look, I will acknowledge that Hans is a controversial thinker. He said plenty of things that I cannot agree with. I count him as a friend, but and his thought has taken him directions that I can't embrace. But nonetheless, we need to stop thinking about intellectuals as either saints or sinners, people to burn or people to canonize. Let's think of all great intellectuals as people we're here to learn from. And I can't think of a better place to learn about systems of politics and economics than Hans Hoppe's Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, 1985. Have a look. Thank you for joining me on Liberty.me's channel, for being a member of Liberty.me, and I'll see you on our website or on our web applications soon enough. All the best, my friends. Take care on this Sunday night. Bye-bye.